Hi, everybody. Before the podcast gets started, welcome to everyone who this is your first podcast because of the title of this one alone, drug you in. You're probably going to be a little disappointed. At no point during this podcast is there anything that even gets close to adult levels of requirement. But this is a podcast that's going to be about the hashtag MeToo, sex abuse, sex harassment, and a systems understanding of, or a discussion around the systems understanding of that problem. If it's for you, welcome aboard. If it's not you, there are hundreds of other podcasts that you may enjoy. Until then, sit back and listen and see what you think. Have fun. Everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I am your host, Todd Conklin. Woo-hoo-hoo! It's the new year. Are you excited? Huh? Yes, it's exciting. And the early podcast of January 2018 is the one that I'm pretty sure is going to be entitled Sex in the New View. It might be Sex and Safety differently, but I think Sex in the New View is probably going to be sexier. I'm guessing this podcast is going to get a lot of hits. We'll see. I could be wrong on this, but I feel like I might be right on it. So we'll see what happens. This is a very interesting podcast. I'm not even going to tell you. I mean, I'll tell you all about the new year, and I'll tell you about my resolution, but I think that's coming up. I'll say that for next. I'm going to focus this one on the topic at hand, because all of, in the United States, and it seems like it's happening in the UK too, if I follow my news correctly. There's been this phenomena with this hashtag Me Too, and in fact, Time Magazine picked as the people of the year the 5 silent women, or 6 silent women. I think there was an elbow of a woman. There's a real the pendulum has swung dramatically around the notion of power, sex harassment, sex abuse, and it's phenomenally interesting to watch. And I got an email a week ago that talked about sort of a systems approach to this issue, and I found it really interesting. And so I pursued the email author, the writer of the email, as it were, and said, "Why don't you come and talk about this a little bit on the podcast?" And he said, "Sure." And so this is our friend Bill Rigo, great friend of the pod, who's a thinker and an engineer and a linear cat, but who also has a side that he talks about on this podcast where he's quite honestly got quite a bit of experience thinking about this problem. And so it seemed perfect. It seemed like the right thing to do this podcast. And so that's what this podcast is. So sit back and listen, because I think this really introduces a frame, and there are many, but a frame by which Bill at least is thinking about this, not only just as a moral failing, but also as a systems challenge. So without much more further ado, at least, here's Bill Rigo and Sex and the New View. What on earth got into you to take a systems view to understanding sort of this hashtag Me Too movement that's happening right now?
Well, I I've got a history of working with my presbytery on. I chaired a sexual misconduct team because most churches, most mainline denominations have had to deal with sexual misconduct in the ministry for many, many years now, and they've done varying degrees of goodness on it, and I won't, comment on that. But what my presbytery did, and we're a group of about 67 churches. We formed a sexual misconduct action team, and so we write the policy on sexual misconduct, and we don't adjudicate cases, but we deal with the aftermath of it, and we also do the mandatory training for these Presbyterian ministers. So all Presbyterian ministers have got to take this class, and so when I saw that Congress was going to have to take these mandatory classes, I thought, this is probably not going to be very good. Ba-
what
based on
what
my
what makes
yeah
you think that based on your history of working for the government?
yeah it's the James Reason blame, train, and write a new procedure model for ineffective corrective actions.
Blame,
So this
train, shame, and no shame, blame, shame. What is it? Shame, blame,
blame,
shame.
shame, um,
No, name, blame,
name,
shame.
blame, shame, train, and write a new procedure.
There you go. That's it.
That's it. That's it. It's the five things. So I was responsible for doing the training with this, and our committee was interesting because we had lawyers who dealt in sexual misconduct cases. We had judges who adjudicated them. We had Presbyterian ministers who were also counselors, and we had professional psychologists who dealt with counseling in sexual abuse cases. And then there was me, the nuclear engineer. And I'd go to these meetings and go, so I'm here for balance. And they didn't think that was funny. Um, and then after 2 years, the chair left and I chaired the committee. So I guess I added balance. But so this Presbyterian minister and I taught this class for 10 years, and we stopped teaching about 3 years ago when we got tired and somebody else went on. But I thought about what we were teaching in the context of the new view and all the things that we've been talking about, and it fit because the training was part of the training and the policy on sexual misconduct was part of what you talk about, that balanced approach of managing prevention, because this is prevention, and then work execution and safeguard. So we would talk about prevention in the ministerial workplace and counseling members of the opposite sex and the landmines associated with that. And then we talk about if you had a predator in your midst, which we have had, how would you know? How would you detect that, and what would you do? And then the third part that you talk about is safeguards and control. And really getting into what Decker talked about in terms of restorative justice. So we're big into restorative justice. So we don't stop at getting the miscreant out of the ministry. We go to the victims and we try to provide some sort of restorative justice to make them whole. Um, which is very different from many other denominations. So I thought about that and I thought, well, this is interesting. And then I went to the drift and accumulation model, which you and I have been teaching for many, many years. And I thought it was a perfect fit for what was going on. So that's kind of how I started this.
Well, tell us what you're thinking, because it's timely and it's interesting, and I do think you're right. I think the sort of the restorative approach to understanding this is really important. It's going to become even more important, I think.
Well, I think so because I mean, you just look at Time Magazine named the silent women as their person of the year this year, which I think was I thought it was appropriate. Then you look at Al Franken's speech yesterday, where he basically cast aspersions on his accusers, saying, "Well, he didn't remember it the way that they did," which means that they must be liars. And so you look at these things where people are just doing bad things and they don't understand really how to make yourself whole after these sorts of events. And so having a sexual predator in your company uh, is can be devastating for that company. So in the case of the Weinstein Company, which is probably the most egregious example I can think of, that company is going to go out of business. I mean, it just can't. It can't stay in business. And so that's a company that lost its way. The whole company was set up to, it appears, to satisfy the sexual proclivities of its owner and founder. And in the end, none of them are going to look very good. Not the board, not the right down to the interns
who were part of this, all these machinations. So companies can go out of business because of this. Politicians lose their careers. Ministers, become disgraced. Churches go into schism because of it. And so the consequences are significant. And of course, you're a degreed psychologist, so you can understand the proclivities of sexual predators. Not that accuse you of that, but you better understand this than I do.
Well, and let me ask you a question because and it's a naive question, but it's a question that I've been thinking about a lot, especially since the email that you wrote that kind of started this discussion. Is this
Yeah.
kind of sexual predation or this kind of event that we're talking about, sort of sex harassment, sex abuse, is it a moral failing? Or is it a function of a gap in our societal systems? Is it a systems problem? Should we ask who failed, or should we ask what failed?
So I'm not going to say that's a good question, because that's what people say when they're stalling for time.
No, it's and I'm not sure I have an answer to this question.
Well, I think the question is rhetorical, because I do believe it's a moral failure, number one, and the fact that it started in Hollywood is no surprise.
But Bill, I
But
mean,
that's been going on for years.
I think the discussion started in Hollywood. I would imagine this kind of sex harassment has been around. Oh, I don't know, since time began, probably.
Well, yes, and so is it a systems failure? Absolutely, and so it's both. But it starts with a moral failure. But then it if you assume that that's going to happen, which I think we should, because we're all human, we're all fallible, we all have different needs and what have you. The question is how do you set up your system to detect and protect yourself from this? So, for example, a church. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I would say the even richer question, and maybe it's the same question, is after we punish Harvey Weinstein, or after we punish Al Franken, or after we punish whoever else, insert name here, what have we fixed?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're emotionally, we've punished the guilty, but have we created an environment where this behavior won't happen? Is shame enough to stop this kind of outcome?
Well, no. And so there's a church in my area where the minister was conducting counseling of married women in his office who were going through marital problems, and he was engaging in sexual relations on his desk with them. And eventually he was discovered and fired and removed from the ministry, so he'll never preach again. But what the church did, they thought about what had happened and their role in all this, and they realized that having a woman behind a closed and locked door with the minister might not be okay. And so what they did was they cut a slot in the minister's door and inserted a piece of glass so that you could see in. It was one of these long, narrow,
right,
up and down windows, so you could see in, but you couldn't hear anything. So whatever he was counseling for the church member, no one would hear, but you could see it. And so there was not much that was going to go on that the church secretary wasn't going to figure out. And we all know about church secretaries. So
they pretty much have everything figured out.
Yeah, they know everything.
Well, and that's interesting because that solution. So I worked a long time for the Boy Scouts at this place called Philmont. And
right.
One of the jobs I had is I was a coordinator of camping services, which I'm not sure if that makes it. Anyways, I was in charge of sort of all the stuff like the chaplains and getting kids on and off the trail and all that kind of stuff. And we years ago, the chaplains got together and we had a meeting, and they said they never want to be in a vehicle alone with just one kid. So we never created an environment where there was an adult and a kid in a vehicle driving somewhere into the backcountry alone. Mm-hmm. We always put two deep leadership, and that was that was a systems defense, right? That was a prevention tool, and I guess in a way kind of a recovery tool, but mostly a prevention tool to create an environment where it'd be hard for that to happen. So I think you're onto something there.
Right. And I had a minister who was a former Army chaplain, and he'd made colonel. But when we were teaching him the class, and he could have taught us, and he did several things. He described an incident where the battalion was deployed somewhere, and Mrs. Smith, who is married to Sergeant Smith, was unhappy, and she called at the chaplain's office, and she said, "Well, I want Chaplain so and so to come down to my quarters at 6 o'clock tonight for counseling, because I'm in distress, and I just need some chaplain's advice." So the chaplain got his chaplain's aide, and he went, "Okay, Corporal Smith, you're going to come with me and to Mrs. Smith's house." And of course the chaplain's aide was not happy about going out after hours, and the chaplain went, "Nope, I'm the colonel, you're the corporal, you're going to do this." So they show up at the appointed hour. Chaplain knocks on the door opens, here's Mrs. Smith, and she's in a flimsy negligee with nothing on underneath. She says, "Oh, Chaplain, it's so good to see you." And then she looks over her shoulder and sees the chaplain's aide, and she slams the door and, and comes back and allows us how perhaps it's not a good time.
Yes. Yes.
And
systems
so,
have mighty powers over behaviors.
Right. And so that was the approach we took with these ministers, that's a tight ass group of folks if you ever want to see one talking about sex. But so when we would start the class, we go, okay, and I do the counting game, by the way, to start the class, which just confused them. And but then I say, okay, tell me what you're afraid of when it comes to this topic. And the number one thing they would talk about is the threat of false accusation. And so I'd write all these things down on a tear sheet, and we'd go through and leave it up on the board. We go through the class, and at the end of the day, because it was an all-day class, and we teach it to ministers on Saturdays, which is their day off, so they didn't want to be there. And so at the end of the day, we're reflecting on the tear sheet, and I go, okay, well, what did you learn about the fear of false accusations? And with all the stories and all the tools that we'd given them, the ministers realized that they had everything they needed so that they would never, ever have a threat of false accusation. So they'd known ministers who had false accusations, but they didn't understand what had led up to it. And so I think the companies that we advise should be encouraged to take this into account, because this is, in my view, if you're looking at an existential threat to a company of sexual abuse or systemic sexual abuse within the workplace, it can be just as bad as a fatality.
So use the drift model and explain to me where you guys are going with this. I think this is an interesting way to look at this.
So the line of work is, as imagined, is management expects that people have read the HR policies, and they've gone to the HR training, and they know that sexual abuse in the workplace is wrong, and everybody understands that, they've read it, and there's no hanky panky going on in the workplace. But the reality is that people will go out, and there'll be workplace flirtations that end up in dates, that end up in something else, or you actually have predators out there that are trying things. And so the thing about predators is that they never stop trying, and they're going to approach boundaries, and they're going to go beyond the boundaries. And so whether it's dating a 14-year-old girl when you're 30 years old, or fondling a USO singer while she's asleep, and having a picture taken of that, those are boundaries that predators would go beyond and keep going, and they just keep doing that. Um, and um, so predators, which are a very small part of the population, um, they aren't governed by rules, and so your prevention methods and your detection methods become increasingly more important, and restorative justice afterwards. So, but people will drift away from work as imagined pretty quickly in this particular subject. It, by the same token, the hidden hazards in the workplace are women who have been sexually or perhaps abused in the workplace that you can't see because they don't talk about it. And where those two lines intersect, you end up with a huge um, uh, workplace, you know, sexual workplace suit that goes to the EEOC, and the company gets fined or they go out of business. And you certainly want to avoid that.
Well, I mean, I think you're onto something. I think just bringing up the question whether it's a moral failing or a deeper systems failing or a combination of both changes
Hmm.
the frame by which you think about this problem. Because it's a really, I mean, I don't know how to say it. I think our tendency is to oversimplify it and to say this happened because this person was bad. This
Hmm.
happened because this person was a predator or a harasser
Hmm.
or whatever word we want. Therefore, if we remove the bad person from Congress
Hmm.
or any company, you name it, the problem goes away. When in fact, I think it's obvious at every level that this isn't really a question of a predator. This is a question of power and position and you think about sort of the power relationships here that exist everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, that's significant. I think it's incredibly interesting that you see the target of the harassment or abuse not reporting as a hidden hazard for the company. I think you're right. I mean, I think the risk is that that seems kind of damning towards the victim, but in fact, that's not the way I took it or you said it. What it really is this incredibly explosive hazard that exists in a company that until that person decides to tell somebody this happened, you don't know that this high potential event coexists every day, comes in and leaves at the end of the day every day within your system. That's a very interesting way to think of this.
Yeah, and I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think you're
Um,
right.
but so I come into this somewhat naively because, for 20 years in the Navy, I worked in nuclear power, and back then we had no women in the program. So my experience in working with women was, pretty low. Um, and so when I hit the workplace, I took over this large training program that had about 160 employees, and they were many of them were women, and which is kind of uncharacteristic for this company. And so I was talking to one of my managers, and I made that observation, and he shut the door and he sat down. And he went, "Let me explain to you what's been going on," because I hadn't been told when I took the job. And the previous manager about a year earlier was a sexual predator and had been not fired for it. He'd been very quietly allowed to retire, which and nobody said anything. He just didn't show up for work one day. He was retired, and I'm making air quotes with my fingers.
Right.
And so he so there was no talk about it. And then an interim manager came in, and I took over as the training manager. And this guy would conduct hiring interviews in the company sedan, driving out into the more rural areas of the site. And so we kind of understand what went on. So um, I realized I was ill-equipped as a manager to deal with this problem of sexual abuse in my workplace. And so I called my secretary in, and she was an older secretary in her early 50s, and I said, "Pat, here's what's going on, and I'm out of the Navy, and I don't have I'm just not sensitive to these things. I want you to be my mentor and teach me about, you know, how to avoid, for me personally, how to avoid what the other guy did, number one. And then number two, how do I manage this with a group of trainers that was about 60% female? And she smiled and she said, I was wondering when you're going to ask me that question. And so she was my original mentor in this. I've since taken on other female mentors, one of which was a nuclear engineer out of Case Western Reserve, and she was extraordinarily good, because we were bringing in probably 40 to 50% of our new engineers were women. And so this in a traditionally male industry of nuclear engineering and chemical engineering, and which is all male dominated forever, and only in the past 15 years did we start to get some incursion of young females into the workplace. And so we had to construct a mentoring program that would give our older mentors, the male engineers, better tools to work with the younger female engineers. And that worked very well.
So what do we take out of this? What are you thinking now? And I'm not going to hold you to this because I think the thinking process is in process. But
Yep.
but what's our new view approach to understanding and moving forward with this?
I think a lot of it goes back to I'll just go back to your book on fatalities, where you talk about you got to have a balanced approach, in the prevention, the work execution, and then the recovery or the safeguards and control. And that is, you've got to have policies in place, you've got to have training in place, but the training has got to be experiential. And you've got to put systems in place like windows in doors and all these management policies about when you have members of the opposite sex together in the workplace, how do you manage that? And then how would you know in work execution that workplace sexual abuse is not taking place? At where I worked, back in the 80s and early with the previous contractor, the sewage lift stations were being clogged with condoms. I don't know if I can say that on your podcast, but
I think you can.
But Bob
You're
Edwards,
the first to ever say that. I will put that on the record.
Yeah, it's a first. So Bob Edwards would call that a weak signal. So nothing was ever done about that, and people just laughed about it. Everybody knew, but nothing was ever done, and none of the nobody went things that make you go and so we just didn't pay attention to what was going on in the workplace, because we're trying to make plutonium and uranium and tritium and all that other stuff. And condoms in the sewage lift station just wasn't a priority. And then the third thing is your recovery from this. So you identify a predator within your workplace and you fire them, and that's fine. Now the company, I think, has some obligation to provide some sort of post-termination counseling, and we do this for ministers who were removed from their pulpits. We provide them professional counseling, and for many months. In fact, we had my own minister back in D.C. before I got into this was fired for this, and he spent weeks down at the Ghost Ranch near Santa Fe, which is, I guess, where Weinstein might be there now. So this place better than I do, not from personal experience, but of course. But,
I do know where it is. Yes.
Yeah. So, but then you've got to be. You can't do what my company did with my predecessor and just get rid of the guy and not say anything about it, because that tells people that it's okay to have sexual abuse. It's not okay to get caught. And so, did you ever read Jack Welch's books? on winning and
Yeah, kinda. Yeah.
So his first book was terrible, but in it he had an interesting discussion about how you train and encourage managers or get rid of them. And in Jack Welch's Simple Mind, he said there's 4 kinds of managers. The first kind shares your values and he makes money for the company, and that manager you reward and promote as much as you can. The second kind of manager is just as easy. He doesn't share your values and he doesn't make money for the company, and you fire him. The third kind of manager is hard because he shares your values, but he's not making money. And that person you put in a different situation in hopes that the values that he promotes within the company will make him successful. But if he doesn't, he's just not a good fit, and you need to get rid of him. He said the fourth kind is the most difficult, and that's the person who doesn't share your values, but he's making money for the company. And Welch's, he admits his biggest mistake was holding on to those guys too much or too long, but they were antithetical to his vision of moving the company forward. And he realized with those people, he needed to fire them and make it public. Companies have got to be able to do that in their recovery efforts, to be able to remove, you certainly need to remove predators from your workplaces, because what they're doing is illegal. It's not immoral, it's illegal. And so, but then you've got to make it public. And the HR lawyers will tell you, oh, you can't do that. That's privileged information. Well, that's a bunch of crap. You've got to make it visible so that people know. It's not just it's not to prevent predators from preying on innocent people. It's so that the workplace understands that management gets it, they understand it, they have values, and they're going to support them.
So let me tweak that language a little, because I think you got better as you told the story.
Uh-huh.
I don't think the word's public, because I do think HR would react to that and has a right to. I think the word is transparent. Is that the solution for a complex problem like this is a transparent answer, and I think transparency really fits in nicely with the notion of restoration. So I think that's where we are. Good conversation, man. You did a good job.
Well,
What'd you think?
You. So
you tackled a hard problem.
Yeah, and it's one people just don't want to talk about, I don't think, up till now. And now they're all using hindsight bias to go, well, everybody knew that. And I think that's so wrong. So I look at this and I go, there's many lessons to get out of this, but we're not going to read them in the newspaper. I think we're going to read them in perhaps academic journals or something later on down the line, but certainly not in today's newspapers.
So there it is. What do you think? The first cut, the first swipe, I guess, to taking a new view approach to a rather large societal issue that has become very, very important. And it's a thoughtful podcast. It's worth your time to listen to, that's for sure. Not much more I can say other than think about the notion of transparency and the notion about the moral implications of this and the systems implications of this. And that'll give you plenty to do today. That'll probably keep you out of trouble. There you go. That's what we wanted to do. Until then, my friends, be brave. Fearless is probably a really good word to use for now. Be fearless. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Learn something new every single day. And for goodness sakes, be safe.
Good goes around and around and around. Good goes around and around.